Hello there, you're listening to the CMOS, the Code Maven open source podcast and video interview series. I'm your host, Gabor Sabo, and with me is Johnny Ray Austin. Hi, Johnny.
Hey, how's it going?
I'm really fine and really happy to have you finally on the show. It was a couple
Glad
of
to be
weeks,
here.
still,
Well, I
still.
went on vacation, so
Oh, that's good. I hope you enjoyed it.
yes.
And I see you're at work right now.
Yeah, I'm in the office today. I know we initially talked about me being at home, but I decided to come on in the office today, so that's why the interesting background is there with the ceiling and stuff.
Yeah, well, I think it's much better than my usual storage room and whatever rooms background I have, wherever I find some uh, space to record these shows. So, anyway, tell me a little bit about your background. How do you get into computing, and
hmm
what kind of stuff you do?
Sure. So I work at ISL, which is a digital agency in Washington, D.C. I work there as a director of technology. As far as how I got into tech, I guess it goes back to high school a bit. I mean, this was like late 90s sort of time frame, and so internet was around, but it wasn't like as prevalent in people's home and whatnot. So it was just really starting to take off. And that kind of brought me into college, where the exposure was a lot more prevalent at that point. Actually, started off majoring in aerospace engineering. Didn't really like it as much as I thought I would, and it was completely random. It was towards the end of the second semester, and I knew I had to change my major, and I didn't know what. And one of my roommate's friends was in there, and I was like, "So, what do you major in?" He was like, "Computer science," and I was just like, "Well, how do you like it?" And he was like, it's cool. And so I changed my major to computer science. Turns out I loved it. So yeah, I've been doing that ever since. Wrote my first program at 19 years old. Got my first job at Lockheed Martin here in DC. Did the contracting stuff for a little while. Then I went to the startup side of the house at Everfi here in DC. And after I left there, came on here to ISL and been doing that ever since.
Nice. So, are you a programmer at ISL or project manager or
So
technology director? I think you wrote.
yeah, so as a technology director, I'm kind of like, I guess I'm both at this point. There's still a significant part of my day I do spend writing code. It's more and more internal tooling. A lot of my efforts are geared towards making other developers who are working on client projects more productive. So, and we'll talk about this in a second, but a bunch of our open source stuff that I contribute to, and also some of the infrastructure stuff. But when I'm not doing that stuff, then it is more of the technical project management, making sure that developers have everything they need in order to be productive, dealing with client requirements, working closely with our strategy team, which is sort of our version of project managers, to make sure that everyone involved, all the stakeholders, have a good understanding of the technical requirements and any challenges that we may face, things like that.
So this ISL, I looked at the website and it has all kind of really nice pictures, but really different things, very different
Yeah,
things.
right, right. Yeah, so I mean, I guess the way we used to describe ourselves is an agency that sort of tries to bridge the gap between the physical and the digital world. So if you look through the website, you'll see things like we call them experiments or stunts, where we will basically take a concept that involves a physical aspect, like for instance, the Nickelodeon SpongeBob project, which basically involved a physical skill crane device that we built out that was internet connected. This was a couple years ago. And basically, that tied into a game on Facebook, which people can log into and play. And it was a competition to see, I think it was like who can like burst the most bubbles or something crazy like that. And then whoever would win a round of the game would actually win control of the skill crane. And you would be able to control it via the web browser, using sort of a virtual representation of the skill crane. So kind of moving around left and right, up and down and whatnot. But it would actually control the physical crane that was, situated like in a warehouse or something like that. And then whatever you were able to pull out, I think you actually won that prize or something. So that's sort of like the sort of thing we're sort of famous for. But other than those type of things, we do like, traditional web application development, websites. We do a lot of social AOR work and things like that, content production.
So this project you mentioned, the Mo project.
Yes. So Mo is essentially a family of projects. So working at an agency is a bit different than a product company. So we're fortunate in that we get to try things over and over and over again. We launch a product and project, and then it goes away, and so then we get to start over, and then we immediately get to take all of the lessons learned from the previous project and immediately apply it to the next thing. And so the Mo projects are basically the living manifestation of all those lessons that we've learned. We're primarily a Django shop. And so all the applications that we built like in Django and whatnot have a lot of common aspects to them, as you would expect with like models and stuff like that. And so Mo Django is a project that has all of that starter code in there. But it's open source. Anyone can clone the repo and start your own project. There's not much that's very specific to ISL. There's very little code that would actually, identify it as an ISL project. So the same goes for Mo Static, which is a project that helps you build static sites really quickly, and supports all of the latest and greatest fancy stuff. ES6 modules and all of the syntax associated with that. We're using Browserify for bundling. Thinking about switching that to Webpack at some point in the future. And there's a flag on there to enable the use of VueJS. That's our official front-end framework that we utilize here. And also, finally, there's Mo Node, which we don't use as much these days, but from time to time we do utilize Node.js as a platform as well. And when we do, we'll go to Mo Node to start those projects.
Oh, so if I understand correctly, then Mo is a project starter. So instead of
exactly.
So if you want a Django project, which and if someone doesn't know that Django is a web development framework in Python, then
right.
Then you can either use the native tools of Django to start it, and then you would get some kind of a skeleton.
Right. So this is all using a project. I don't know if you've ever heard of Cookie Cutter, very similar to like Yeoman. But Cookie Cutter basically allows you to templatize the creation of like files and directories and stuff like that. So under the covers, it's using Cookie Cutter to generate a Django ready project for you. So all of the initial files for like models and the project name and domains, and it's tied to Heroku as well. Heroku configurations and stuff like that is instantly generated for you, and the idea is you can get started quickly. I mean, from clone to running on port 8000, depending on your internet connection, probably only takes about 2 to 3 minutes. It's basically, like I said, it's the accumulation of all the solutions to problems we faced in the past, particularly with like getting started and having flexibility to do stuff.
Okay, and the other two, so the one that is generating static, that doesn't generate any Django thing, right? It's just the static.
Right. Yep. It's just focused on static websites. Essentially everything. So the build step basically just puts all your it pre-processes all your source files and then dumps it in your public directory, and you can go in there and like start a static web server, and then it'll just serve all the files as is.
Mm-hmm. And then the third one would again not without Django, it would just create a Node.js.
Yes, it's just a Node app.
Okay.
Yep.
So even with Django, but even with smaller frameworks, I have a feeling that you have a long learning curve. So it might create a lot of really nice things, the skeleton or whatever you call it. But then, I mean, at least personally, I feel lost. That okay, so where do you get started there? How do you deal with that?
So I think that if you look at it, you'd find that there isn't as much in there as you may think. So it's a skeleton, it's a starter. It's not about giving you a whole lot of stuff. It's about giving you the right stuff to get started. We've actually gone through several iterations long before it was called the Mo projects that were called like the scale projects. That's sort of the precursor, and it was closed source to what the Mo projects are. And one of the problems we faced with the scale projects was just like you said, there was a lot of stuff in there, and it was really hard for someone to kind of just walk into those projects and be able to know like where everything was and what was going on. The idea is if you're already a Django developer, even a fairly new Django developer, you can generate a Mojango project and just know where everything is. We don't deviate really at all from like industry best practices. That was a really big thing as well. We didn't want to have like all this custom directory structure type stuff going on. We really tried to keep it middle of the road so that anyone who has done any Django development in the past can come on board and get started. And that was really important because of onboarding. Um, Typically, our onboarding process would involve, when we did the scale stuff, basically going through all of these scale projects and walking people through them, what was in there and what wasn't, how you configure them, and all this other stuff, which just essentially wasted a lot of people's time. People who are JavaScript developers and do front end should be able to come into Mostatic and just get started. People who are Django developers should be able to come into Mojango and just get started. So that's kind of what we kept in mind.
So how many people do you think are using these tools? Do you have any information about that?
Don't have a whole lot of information about that. I did use Mostek. So from time to time, I do teach a JavaScript course for General Assembly here in DC. And for a bunch of the students in there, I was actively using Mostatic as a tool for them. So I know a bunch of people there were using it and still are using it. But honestly, we don't have like any really hard numbers. The projects are fairly new. They've only been open for a few months now, so you're still going to see a whole lot of activity, particularly around the Mojango stuff, as we sort of mature these projects. But we use them for client-facing projects all the time, and so they're definitely production ready. But I don't have any real hard numbers for you right now.
Okay, and do you have contributors, outside contributors from not from ISL?
I think there have been like just a handful of contributors, particularly around the Django stuff. Not so much the Node stuff. We use that less and less, so it has like the least a bit of activity of all the projects. But I think the Django stuff has the most contributors outside of ISL. But I think it's only actually a handful of people at this point. So shameless plug, looking for contributors. So head to the iStrategy Labs. That's our old name. GitHub, and just look at Mojango or Mostatic, and you'll find the projects there.
So why have you? Okay, now you're looking for people to help you, but why have you open sourced it in the first place? Is this the first open source project from ISL?
No, it's not the first. It's sort of the first suite of projects that we're sort of actively pushing. They're open because they can be open. Like I said, this isn't a bunch of ISL secret sauce stuff in here. These are tools that allow us to be productive and do our jobs well. And if we're finding good ways to create tools to allow ourselves to be productive, we want to make sure we give that back to the community as well. Depending on regardless of how many people actually use them, we consume open source projects all the time. And so we felt that it was right that if we have anything that we can contribute back to the community, then we feel like we have a duty to do so. So just the fact that they can be open source is reason enough for us to just open source them.
Okay, so Django and then VueJS, right?
Yeah, so VueJS is not ours. Obviously, it's a framework that is comparable to React, which is a lot more popular. So traditionally, we've been an AngularJS shop, Angular 1.x, and as of a couple months ago, we've officially made the switch from AngularJS to VueJS as our go-to framework for front-end development. And there are a lot of reasons for that. If you look on the ISL blog, I wrote a post about some of the reasons we switched over. But essentially, anyone who's ever done any AngularJS development, I personally like the framework, but there's a lot there. You know, it's an all or nothing sort of thing. Once you bring in AngularJS, then it's an AngularJS application no matter what. There's no getting around the framework. And the more you fight it, the more difficult it becomes. And there are a lot of concepts and a lot of baggage and a lot of learning, a big learning curve that has to be overcome in order to become really productive in AngularJS outside the context of just like the basics. All these things about services and factories and constants and then directives are themselves, you know, a bunch of concepts. And so, particularly when we talk about bringing on junior developers and getting them up to speed, it was quite a lift. Vue.js, on the other hand, focuses on just the view layer of building user interfaces, which is what we really needed. And there are very few concepts and new concepts to actually learn. It's dealing mainly with components and state data in your application, and that's really it. Everything else is just an outcry from that. The documentation is really stellar, so it makes it really easy for fairly inexperienced people to come up to speed on how to use the framework. And also, we have people on our team who their previous job were designers, and so they haven't been developers for very long. So a lot of those concepts aren't as firm with them as they may be with some of the more seasoned developers. So the fact that they're able to come on board, go to the documentation, take about 30 minutes and walk away and just say, hey, I think I have a really good handle on this stuff is really important for us as a company in terms of productivity.
Mm-hmm. So who do you recommend? Have you looked at Angular 2 since then? And
I've looked at it. I haven't done anything with it. It does seem interesting. So before we switched to Vue.js, I mean, we did some investigation. This was back when Angular 2 was sort of still in active development. So we looked at Angular 2 briefly. We looked at React as well. We actually did a project with React to try it out. We looked at Ember.js and a couple other frameworks that escaped my mind so far. And there were pros and cons to everything. Ember was like really structured in how it approached web development. Very opinionated. It's a framework like Angular 1.x, but you know it had a little bit more maturity to it, and the fact that it was compatible with the JSON API spec out of the box was really great because that's a spec that we've adopted for all of our APIs. So that was a big benefit there. React was very close to Vue.js and sort of its view of the world and its approach to components. And actually, even as we talk, they're converging in terms of like functionality and whatnot with the release of Vue.js 2.0. And honestly, the only thing that kept us from moving towards React was JSX is sort of a hot topic in that world. And a couple of people, including myself, weren't really crazy about having the markup that closely tied to the JavaScript. I know there are advantages to it, and people have written some really good arguments for it. But you know, it didn't seem conducive of the type of software we were trying to build. And so we ultimately decided to go with Vue.js for that reason. And also the documentation is really great. And coming from AngularJS 1.x, where the documentation was.
yeah, we got disconnected. Yeah, sorry, we got for a couple of seconds disconnected. So you said about AngularJS, where the documentation was good or bad. That's where we got it cut off.
Yeah, so I was contrasting the Vue.js documentation with the Angular 1.x documentation. And one of the reasons why I love the documentation for Vue.js so much is because it's so much better than Angular.1x documentation. I don't know, it's clearly generated from, you know, the code base and whatnot, but you know that doesn't always translate well to communicating with humans, I guess. Yeah.
Great. I think we are just running out of time, so
Okay.
that's great. I mean, I personally learned quite a few things here, and I'm really glad that you talked about them.
Hmm.
So let's wrap this up now. And there were
Yeah.
a couple of other subjects we mentioned that we might talk about later. And I definitely will
Okay.
want to see, I don't know, a couple of months from now, if you're
Sure.
still using Vue.js or if you have changed to something else, and see the reason, because that kind of
Yeah.
changes is really interesting, and see the reasoning behind that.
Sure.
So
Sure.
do you have anything else that you wanted to mention maybe, and to have a shout out to some people or projects?
Yeah, so I'll just say, well, first of all, thanks for having me on. As far as a shout out, I'll shout out ISL. Go to isl.co, check us out. We have some really cool work. We have a couple positions open, so check us out there. Follow me on Twitter, Recursive Funk. That's Funk with the K, not the C. Yeah, that's it.
So thank you very much then for coming on the show, and see you later. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.